What do your morning cup of coffee, a numbing injection at the dentist's office, a red can of the world's favorite soda, and a multiplying herd of wild hippos in the South American jungle all have in common? Every single one of them is a direct, long-term byproduct of the exact same historical anomaly. An anomaly that started 8,000 years ago with a simple mountain shrub. In the late 1980s, to gain total control over this single plant, the ruthless Colombian kingpin Pablo Escobar ordered an act of terror that shocked the entire Western Hemisphere. He commanded his hitmen to blow up a commercial airliner, Avianca Flight 203, carrying 107 innocent passengers on board. He did it because he believed a political enemy, presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria, was sitting on that plane. But here is the chilling twist. Gaviria changed his plans at the last minute and never boarded. Escobar's Basque bomb maker, Efraim Gonzalez, built a device disguised as a tape recorder, and a tragic young man carried it onto the flight without knowing what it truly was. 107 people in the sky, and 3 more on the ground, died in an instant for a target who was safely at home. During those peak years of bloodshed, Escobar's organization was so flooded with paper currency that they faced a literal physical problem. They were earning so much cash that they spent $2,500 every single month just on basic rubber bands, simply to keep the massive brick-sized bundles of bills from falling apart. Forbes magazine had already named Escobar one of the richest men on the planet, with a personal fortune estimated as high as $30 billion. Once, while hiding in the mountains, Escobar reportedly burned $2 million in cash just to keep his young daughter warm. But here is the ultimate, mind-bending paradox. The thing people killed for, the thing that caused oceans of blood to spill in the city of Medellin, and the thing that laundered trillions of dollars through major Western banks, is, in its raw form, completely mild. Chewing its green leaf delivers less of a physical jolt to the body than a single cup of regular black coffee. How did a humble Andean shrub become the driving engine of the most profitable criminal industry in human history? To understand that, we have to look at how nature created the ultimate survival tool, only for humanity to turn it into a global weapon. Let's travel back to the Stone Age. The high-altitude valleys of the Andes Mountains, in what is now northern Peru. The air up there is freezing and thin, oxygen is scarce, and the rocky soil makes harvests incredibly brutal. Life for ancient humans was a daily struggle against pure exhaustion and cold. But the ancient indigenous people found a biological cheat code. Excavating 80-century-old huts in the Nanchok Valley, modern archaeologists discovered a highly specific pairing buried deep beneath the dirt floors. They found ancient coca leaves buried alongside pieces of calcium-rich rock that had been burned and scraped to create alkaline lime. Why does this specific pairing matter so much? Because without that alkaline trigger, the plant's magic doesn't work. Stone Age humans, without knowing the scientific word chemistry, had already figured out the exact chemical reaction required to unlock the plant. When a chewer tucks a wad of leaves into the cheek along with a pinch of alkaline ash, the alkaline material slowly coaxes the active compounds out of the leaf. In its natural, organic form, the chewed leaf releases its compounds slowly and gently into the human bloodstream. It does not create a sudden rush. Instead, it slowly dulls the feeling of hunger. It blunts physical fatigue. It takes the sharp edge off freezing mountain cold and prevents altitude sickness. Furthermore, the leaves themselves are packed with calcium, iron, and essential vitamins. In a vertical world of thin air and thinner harvests, coca was never a vice. It was necessary survival equipment. It was the sole difference between a farmer finishing the mountain harvest or collapsing halfway through it. Over centuries, Andean societies domesticated this wild shrub. They carefully selected and replanted seeds until they created a hardy, resilient plant that thrived on steep, misty mountainsides where almost nothing else of economic value could grow. The name itself likely comes from an ancient Aymara word meaning simply the tree. Not a tree, but the tree. That single linguistic detail tells you everything about its elevated status. By about 2,000 years ago, coca was tightly woven into every civilization along the Andes. Mochi and Nazca potters sculpted thousands of ceramic figures with one cheek distinctively bulging, creating the unmistakable portrait of a coca chewer. But it was the massive Inca Empire in the 15th century that elevated the leaf into a literal state religion. The Incas wrote the leaf into their theology, claiming it was a divine gift from the sun god, delivered through a beautiful spiritual woman named Mama Coca. The empire ran on a high-speed relay system of runners called chasqui, who sprinted between roadside stations carrying urgent imperial messages from the coast to the capital at Cusco. This human messaging system could move information around 150 miles in a single day. It was a pony express running at full gallop for centuries early, operating at 12,000 feet above sea level, powered entirely on the stamina of green leaves. But sacred does not always mean gentle. High on the frozen summit of the Lolalalico volcano, at over 20,000 feet, archaeologists found the perfectly preserved, frozen bodies of 3 Inca children left as ritual sacrifices 500 years ago. Modern chemical analysis of their hair showed heavy, continuous coca use in their final months of life. The leaf was used to ease them up a freezing mountain they would never come down from. Then, in 1532, everything changed. A small force of 168 Spanish conquistadors under Francisco Pizarro ambushed the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, and the greatest empire in the Americas collapsed. The Spanish took the gold, they took the silver, but the leaf, at first, they absolutely despised. The Catholic clergy saw coca everywhere in native spiritual rituals and concluded it was an instrument of idolatry. The First Council of Lima in 1552 officially condemned it, and churchmen dismissed the leaf as a talisman of the devil. But in 1545, the Spanish found a single mountain, and every theological objection in the European empire suddenly became negotiable. That mountain was Cerro Rico at Potosi, in modern Bolivia, rising over 13,000 feet above sea level. It turned out to be the richest silver strike ever discovered in human history, eventually supplying more than half of all the silver flowing through the early modern world. To dig that silver out, the Spanish revived and perverted an old Inca labor system called the mita, forcing tens of thousands of Andean men into the mountain. The conditions were medieval and horrific. Miners descended on fragile rope ladders into dark, candlelit tunnels and stayed underground for up to a week at a time, breathing toxic rock dust in the pitch black, hauling heavy or on their backs up hundreds of feet of vertical ladders. Outside the mines, at the processing refineries, indigenous workers waded bare-legged through toxic pools of mercury used to separate the silver from the stone. The heavy metal poisoning showed quickly in their trembling hands, failing lungs, and falling hair. The air at that altitude was freezing, food was scarce, and the Spanish colonial masters noticed something vital. The men who were given coca leaves worked longer hours, required far less food, and complained less about the horror around them. The moral debate ended almost overnight. The Spanish crown suddenly declared coca essential to the well-being of the native workers. Colonial planters took over the warm valleys, and a massive supply chain began hauling millions of leaves up to the freezing mines. By the late 1500s, coca was one of the most heavily traded commodities in Peru, and the Catholic Church, the exact same institution that had called the leaf demonic, was now collecting a strict 10% tithe on every single basket of leaves sold. Wealthy European bishops were, in a very real sense, directly funded by the economics of coca. Potosi silver was minted into global pieces of 8, becoming the world's very first global currency. These coins bought spices, Manila, silk in China, and funded mercenary armies across Europe. Popular accounts claim that millions of indigenous people died in those colonial mines over the centuries. While modern historians still debate the exact number, what no one disputes is that generations of Andean men were marched into that mountain, to their deaths. And the energy extracted from the coca leaf is exactly what kept them digging. Coca did not just witness the plunder of the Americas, coca actively subsidized it. For the next 300 years, Europe itself barely touched the plant. The reason was purely logistical. Coca leaves lose their chemical potency within weeks. And the sailing voyage from Peru to Europe took many months. The samples that reached European doctors arrived stale, brown, and chemically unimpressive. The Atlantic Ocean was, in effect, a massive natural cage that held the plant's power in check. Then, in a quiet German laboratory, the cage broke wide open. In 1860, a 25-year-old chemistry student in Göttingen named Albert Niemann isolated the active alkaloid compound of the leaf in its pure, concentrated crystalline form. He named it cocaine, and he noted, almost in passing, that the white powder completely numbed the human tongue. Neiman died the very next year, but his white crystals survived him, and they were about to conquer the Western world. The first person to get rich off this scientific breakthrough was not a doctor, but a brilliant marketer. In 1863, a Corsican chemist named Angelo Mariani began steeping treated coca leaves in Bordeaux wine, selling the commercial result as Vin Mariani. He marketed it as a premium tonic for energy, health, and total vitality. Think of it as the Red Bull of the 19th century. If Red Bull came in a premium, why Model N carried a direct endorsement from the Vatican? Because it actually did. Pope Leo XIII was reportedly so fond of Vin Mariani that he awarded its creator an official Vatican gold medal and allowed his papal face to appear on the commercial advertising posters. His successor, Pope Pius X, drank it too. Thomas Addison endorsed it. Queen Victoria enjoyed it. And US President Ulysses S. Grant, dying of throat cancer and racing to finish his personal memoirs to save his family from bankruptcy, drank it constantly. As he wrote, Mariani had assembled the greatest celebrity endorsement roster of his century for a product whose key ingredient would one day carry a mandatory prison sentence. Medicine came running right behind the marketers. In 1884, a young, ambitious, and chronically broke Viennese neurologist named Sigmund Freud published a medical paper titled Über Coca. It was an almost giddy hymn of praise. Freud recommended the white powder for fatigue, for severe depression, for digestive trouble, and, most fatefully, as a miracle cure for morphine addiction. He tested that last idea on his close friend, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, a brilliant physiologist who was heavily hooked on morphine after a botched medical amputation, left him in constant, agonizing pain. At first, the experiment seemed to work, but soon, Fleischl began taking enormous quantities of the new drug. He developed full-blown psychosis, spending his nights convinced that thousands of imaginary insects were crawling beneath his skin. He died in 1891 at the age of 45, severely addicted to both drugs at the exact same time. Freud spent years trying to live that medical tragedy down. But that same year, 1884, another young Viennese doctor named Karl Koller read Freud's research and saw something completely different. Koller was an eye specialist with a brutal, daily medical problem. General ether anesthesia, the great miracle of the age, was nearly useless for delicate eye surgery because patients coughed and retched violently as they regained consciousness, instantly ruining delicate incisions. Eye operations were therefore performed on fully conscious patients who were held down by force, forced to watch the surgical blade approach their eye. Koller remembered that Niemann's crystals numbed the tongue. He dissolved a small amount in water and dripped the solution directly into an eye. The eye went completely, blissfully numb. In September of 1884, his findings were presented to a medical congress, and surgery changed overnight. For the first time in human history, a doctor could completely switch off pain in one precise part of the body, while the patient sat calmly awake. Every single local anesthetic that followed, Novocaine in 1905, lidocaine in the 1940s, and the injection that numbs your jaw at the dentist today, is a direct chemical descendant of cocaine, redesigned to keep to numbness and lose the rest. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Georgia, a wounded Confederate veteran was about to make the plant immortal. John Pemberton was a pharmacist who had been slashed across the chest by a saber in the final weeks of the Civil War. Like thousands of injured veterans, he came home severely addicted to medical morphine. Searching for a cure, he cooked up his own alcoholic imitation of Vin Mariani. But in 1886, his county suddenly went dry under local prohibition laws. Pemberton scrambled to create a non-alcoholic version. He mixed a sweet syrup of coca leaf extract with caffeine-rich cola nuts, blended it with carbonated water, and sold it at a pharmacy soda fountain for 5 cents a glass. His bookkeeper, Frank Robinson, suggested a catchy name and sketched it in a flowing script: Coca-Cola. It was marketed not as a refreshing treat, but as a brain tonic for headaches and nervous exhaustion. Pemberton, sick and still addicted, sold off his rights to the company for a total of around $2,300, and died in poverty in 1888. He never saw a single dime of the multi-billion-dollar empire his formula created. By the turn of the century, the national romance with the miracle drug curdled into pure fear. Medical journals filled with reports of ruined patients. Coca-Cola quietly removed the active alkaloid from its formula by about 1903, switching to spent leaves with the drug already extracted. The backlash that followed was driven heavily by racism. In the early 1900s, Southern newspapers and medical journals began publishing fabricated stories about cocaine-crazed men, claiming the drug gave them superhuman strength and made them immune to bullets. The 1914 Harrison Narcotic Act restricted the drug into effective prohibition, and by 1922, imports were banned. By the middle of the 20th century, the white powder had all but vanished from American life, its role as the everyman stimulant filled by perfectly legal, mass-produced amphetamine pills. But it was only waiting. What came next was the 1970s, and the second act made the first look quaint. As amphetamines were restricted and disco lit up the night, the drug returned to America as the ultimate glamour symbol. At Studio 54, it was part of the decor. On Wall Street, it was part of the workday. At roughly $100 a gram, it was marketed by its sheer price as the champagne of drugs. Demand exploded. And 2,000 miles to the south, a handful of men in Medellin, Colombia, realized they were sitting on the trade opportunity of the century. Colombia sat directly between the leaf fields of Peru and Bolivia, and the wealthiest consumer market on earth. Pablo Escobar industrialized the route. Product was refined in makeshift jungle laboratories and flown north in small planes. At its peak, the Medellin cartel supplied 80% of the product entering the United States, with daily revenues hitting an estimated $60 million. The cash became a physical problem. Escobar's brother later claimed the organization wrote off roughly 10% of its cash every single year because hungry rats ate the bills or mold ruined them in underground storage. Their accounting books included a literal line item for rats. On those billions, Escobar built a sprawling estate with its own private zoo, importing for hippopotamuses. Then came the total war against the state. The policy of Escobar toward officials was plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet. Judges, journalists, and police officers were murdered by the hundreds. In 1993, Escobar was finally shot dead on a Medellin rooftop, but the trade did not miss a single shipment. The Cali cartel absorbed the market, and control of the routes later migrated north to Mexican organizations. Meanwhile, in the mid-1980s, the drug mutated on American streets into a cheap, smokable form known as crack, sold in single doses for just $5. The chemical difference was simple. While powder was a hydrochloride salt that took time to cross the blood-brain barrier, crack was freebase, delivering an intense, overwhelming rush in just 8 seconds. A drug that had been a status symbol for the rich was suddenly devastating the poorest blocks in America. Investigative journalists later revealed dark connections, showing that during the Contra War in Nicaragua, groups supported by the CIA were directly involved in trafficking cocaine into U.S. cities to fund their military operations. In 1986, college basketball star Len Bias died of a drug-induced heart failure, detonating a national panic. Congress rushed to pass the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which set an infamous, racially biased threshold. Possessing just 5 grams of cheap crack triggered the exact same 5-year mandatory minimum prison sentence as 500 grams of expensive powder. The same drug, into different forms, was punished at a ratio of 100 to 1. Because crack was concentrated in poor black neighborhoods while powder circulated in wealthier white ones, the sentencing gap fell entirely along racial lines. But where did those tens of billions of dollars a year go? They went straight into the global banking system. In 2010, Wachovia, one of the largest banks in the United States, admitted it had failed to monitor around $378 billion in transfers from Mexican currency exchange houses used by the cartels. The penalty was a minor fine, and not a single banker went to prison. 2 years later, HSBC paid $1.9 billion over similar failures, with investigators describing cartel cash arriving in boxes custom built to fit the exact dimensions of the bank teller windows. Since 1971, the United States alone has spent an estimated $1 trillion fighting the war on drugs. The result? According to the United Nations, global cultivation recently hit the highest level ever recorded in human history, yielding over 2,700 tons of pure product in a single year, with a market worth over $100 billion annually. And now, for the final, ultimate irony. Cocaine is still a perfectly legal medicine in the United States. It sits in Schedule II precisely because it has accepted medical uses. As recently as 2020, the FDA approved new prescription solutions for surgery. Ear, nose, and throat surgeons still use it because no modern substitute numbs tissue and shrinks blood vessels at the exact same time quite as well. The supply chain behind that fact is even stranger. In Maywood, New Jersey, a chemical firm called the Stepan Company holds a rare federal registration to legally import coca leaves by the ton. The medicinal extract goes to pharmaceutical firms. The leftover leaf flavoring, with the drug completely removed, goes to exactly one famous customer, the Coca-Cola Company. There is, in other words, still legally imported coca leaf in your soda today. Statistically speaking, a microscopic trace of this entire story is folded in your wallet right now, riding on 9 out of 10 United States banknotes. And those for hippos that Escobar imported. They escaped after his death, thrived in the rivers of Colombia, and have multiplied into a wild population of well over 150 animals. His empire collapsed in a day, but his invasive hippos are still winning. Meanwhile, high in the valleys of Bolivia and Peru, a local farmer will tuck a wad of green leaves into his cheek tomorrow morning before climbing to his field. He will do it exactly as his ancestors did before the Egyptian pyramids were built. Because over 8,000 years, the leaf has not changed at all. We did. What part of this hidden history surprised you the most? The Vatican gold medals, the secret Coca-Cola contract, or the wild Colombian hippos? Let me know in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe for more deep dives. See you in the next one.